Ukraine, but it's had a very difficult and tragic past few years. It was captured by the Russians in early 2022 and suffered some of the worst atrocities of the war. So I'm going to read this to you now. Do be warned, of course, this is some fairly difficult stuff to read because a lot of what has happened in Ukraine is very difficult and tragic to hear. Okay, so the segment I'm reading starts with Chapter 5, The Wrath of the River, Occupation, Liberation and Agony in Kherson. The Tempest, Kherson, June 2023. Even the dead had not seen the end of this war. Corpses floated downstream, the tempest having washed these poor souls from their resting places in the village graveyards that had once dotted the banks of the Dnipro. This great river's levees had burst, and thousands of metric tons of water were washing away anything not firmly moored. One Ukrainian soldier serving there aptly described the flooded city of Kherson as the Venice from hell. Instead of intricately carved wooden gondolas carrying honeymooning couples down antique Italian canals, Ukrainian soldiers on small rubber speedboats were ferrying desperate civilians to safety under the most deadly fire. The violently exhumed bodies of long dead Ukrainians were not the only form of foulness these waters were carrying. Oil and industrial chemicals had mixed with landmines and unexploded ammunition that had swept from hastily abandoned frontline positions on both sides of the river. More than 600 square kilometres of dry land, much of it Ukraine's most fertile, was submerged by these torrents. Several times an hour, a boat would pull up to the street and civilians would pile out. Sometimes desperate relatives would be on hand to embrace them. Other times they'd be taken straight to a humanitarian aid shelter for aid, food and water. Others carried their terrified and soaking pets in cages. The Ukrainian people's care for the most vulnerable members of their communities, including their animals, would never cease to touch my heart. It was on that river that I heard the faint whistle which turned into the screech of a banshee as I saw the rocket streak down in front of us, smashing into the water perhaps 50 metres ahead of our boat. It wasn't the sight, which was over in a second, but the sound and the shockwave that were overwhelming. The cacophony of shells heading towards you is utter terror that no video can convey. It is otherworldly, and the second it takes to close in on you feels stretched into an hour in your mind. The first shell landed in front of us. Then I closed my eyes and heard another, and then another. Each of us on the boat knew that we may die and there wasn't a thing that we could do about it now. Once this volley had passed, the laid-back Dutch journalist next to me on our tiny boat, Chris, said that shortly before the ride, he bought an engagement ring that he was carrying with him like a lucky charm. I'm going to ask my girlfriend to marry me next week, so we really have to make it out of this. On the way back to shore, we saw a speedboat piloted by a Ukrainian Special Forces soldier with 2 civilians in tow zip past the partially submerged sign. It had a photo of a Ukrainian soldier saluting, with a slogan in bold lettering running across. Kherson is Ukraine, it said. But what an awful price this city had had to pay for its freedom. The people here had spurned the idea of the Russian world, and now the Russians were punishing them by raining an endless hell on the thousands of civilians left behind. How different the scenes had been just over 6 months ago, when Volodymyr Zelensky had strode through a jubilant crowd, waving Ukrainian flags, singing the national anthem and ripping down Russian propaganda posters that adorned the streets. Kherson had just been liberated from 8 months of violent occupation, and the president had told a waiting pool of reporters, me among them, that this was the beginning of the end. Here was just the latest in a string of Ukrainian victories. The national mood was buoyant and the Russians were retreating throughout the country. The city itself had survived the recent fighting almost completely intact. Who could blame him for his optimism? Yet 2 hours later, we could have all been dead after a Russian artillery shell hit the clearing from just across our press bus. I wrote at the time that it was a sign the city is not out of danger yet. No one could have known the agony that awaited Kherson. Hell is empty, and all the devils are here, Shakespeare wrote in his own Tempest.
Hello everyone, today I am with my friend Yu already know this person because it's not our first and not our last interview, but still we
It's
are
about our third, is it now?
not first.
Third or fourth. It's been a fair few as well.
Yes. We are now in London because yesterday Tom had a presentation finally of, yes, it's one for you and for me,
Yeah.
of his book.
And one for everyone watching, I'm hoping, as well.
Yes, you can buy this book. I'm going to show it closer.
Yeah.
It's called Dogs of Mariupol.
Yeah.
Russia invasion and the forging of Ukraine's iron generation. Yeah. Tom Mutch is the author. I love your hot picture in it.
Yeah, that one at the back. So, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you, Madison, for taking this photo, by the way. So yeah. Anyway, let's get started. What do you want to know?
Everything. Yesterday was a pretty successful launch. Congratulations, big event, and a lot of people came, and I was really happy to see you're in your diva star era signing all the books. And we also had an interview with BBC yesterday, and today was me. I'm honored.
There we are.
All right, tell me how it all started. When was the moment when you realized that you actually want to write a book?
I remember the moment very specifically, actually, because it's probably quite helpful if I turn to... This book has pretty pictures as well, so there, a lot of these are...
Probably will not be visible because we're against the light, but you can try.
I'll take it closer because I think it's sometimes worth showing off. So these are some of the photos I've taken of the book, and this one... Is that it there? Can you see it there? So this one right at the end here was taken in Bakhmut in April 2023. And I was embedded with Ukraine's 80th Air Assault Division, and these are a couple of the people that I met when I was there. Now, this young woman I'd actually met just in a bar in Kyiv about 2 or 3 weeks before the full-scale invasion began, and then she had gone on to join the army and sort of become a press officer, and she's now a drone pilot working in a different brigade. And I just remember that extraordinary contrast between seeing her, just like as a kind of like a normal average young woman that you'd see everywhere. And then a year and a half later, here she was like, in a jacket, body armor, this kind of like warrior. And it just struck me because while that was the most striking example in my mind, that's what I found so interesting about Ukraine, is seeing all of those people. There's hundreds of thousands of people like that who joined the army, who went out to fight. Many of them didn't come back. The young man that I showed the photo of next to her, they were engaged, and he was killed in Kursk towards the end of 2024. Many of them, very, very badly injured. The hospitals and streets of Kiev are full of, amputees, people with war injuries. And many of them are still out. Those who are alive, often they're still out there. Some of them have been there for 3 years. There are people who've been there since 2014 that are still there. They've been there for 10 years. And I just thought, and there were a good number of examples of those. I remember, for instance, a married couple. The guy was from Crimea. He was from, I think, Simferopol. Obviously his town had been under occupation. And then he'd moved to Kiev and he'd met his wife, and they were both lawyers. They have now gone out. They have since gone out to fight. I met them near Slavyansk back in June 2022. They're still in the army. He got quite badly injured, but he recovered after took a year of rehabilitation and went back to the army afterwards. Another one was one of the main characters in the book is a guy named Ksenia Mirgorodska, who was Ukraine's education minister. Again, I met him in the same trench that I met those two in, and he had been like kind of a well-known public intellectual, sort of kind of philosophy rock star sort of person, and then all of a sudden he came, he was called up to fight, and he went and fought, and then he was actually taken from the front lines and went on to serve as Zelensky's education minister. And I just thought it was incredible because it is this huge, big snapshot of people that we'd recognize in our ordinary lives from the sort of, poorest bottom rung, if you want to say, to the kind of most elite levels of Ukrainian society, all who are fighting in this war together. Now, you can unpack that a bit more. Obviously, not everybody has done this. Obviously, there's divisions between people who stayed and left. There's plenty of people who don't fight or don't want to. The service is pretty horrific now. It's not glamorous anymore like it might have been in 2022. It's now known to be like a really long, hard slog. And I kind of wanted to tell that story, the story of the sort of the heroism of Ukraine on the one hand, but also break down just how sort of brutal and pitiless this war can be, and the extraordinary human cost that the Russian invasion's taken on Ukraine as well.
So still, when was the moment when you realized that you want to put it all in the book?
I think it was, as I said, when I came back from Bakhmut, when I came back from that meeting, with that embed, I was like, I've now got, that was like when the seed was planted. That was like, I was like, that's such like a perfect contrast in my mind. And it's such a good, relatable human story. That's why the BBC featured it yesterday, because it's one of those things that we can all easily relate to. And, you know, that really sort of brings home and makes us connect with the war more. And so that's where the idea sort of the idea of the Iron Generation, who are these young people who joined up to fight. And the actual quote comes from, is modified from something that Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission chief, said. She called it like the golden generation of Ukrainians, many of whom were being killed. And I was like, I like the phrase, but I don't think gold is quite the right metal, right? I think iron is better. Gold is like flashy and malleable, but it's, you know, it's a very malleable metal. It's not worth very much outside of like its value as, you know, currency, right? Whereas iron is like forged under, you know, real pressure and fire, and turns into something, you know, really kind of strong and hardy and useful. It's the thing that you build stuff with. That's why I called it the Iron Generation.
And the picture we see on the front is a picture you took in Mariupol, right?
No, this isn't Mariupol. This is in Kiev. This is on the. This is Kreshchatyk. So
right.
Yeah. So and I just thought it's a really interesting photo because, you know, this is the main. I'll hold it up and you can have a closer look if you want.
We'll put the picture.
Pardon? Yeah. So put the picture. So it's like, you know, you have Kreshchatyk. They were showing off, you know, on their, I think it was the Ukrainian Independence Day. Yeah. They would do a demonstration, basically blown up Russian tanks and armoured vehicles and artillery pieces. They'd lay them all out on the streets in Kreshchatyk for us to see. Obviously, there's the poster in the background, Azovstal, Free Mariupol Defenders, which has been there ever since the fall of Mariupol in May 2022. And there's just a guy like riding a Bolt delivery. I think is that Bolt? Yeah, it's a Bolt food delivery driver, just kind of, you know, biking past like nothing's happening, which is because I wanted to bring home how war and peace sort of coexist next to each other in Ukraine, even in Kiev.
It's interesting. I'm thinking now of this guy. Do you know that he's actually in the book cover?
I have no idea. I have absolutely. Yeah, actually, there's another person as well who is in the photos. You see this one here. Maybe you could put that one up on screen later as well.
Yes.
It's a young woman and her friend who was celebrating their graduation in Shevchenko University. I just snapped the photo randomly on the street. At some point, I would really like to find who these women are so I can show them that their photo made it into my book, because I thought I captured a really nice moment. People were like, wow, it's just amazing to see that this kind of life and these kind of celebrations are still going on in Kiev, even though it's a city at war.
Maybe we will try to find these girls. I think it might be possible.
I think it would be possible. I mean, I can find the date that I took that photo, and I can probably find the graduate, you know, the graduation class.
Well, so investigation. That sounds like
an investigation.
We will put the photo so you could see as well.
Yeah. And if anyone recognizes either of them, please let me know.
All right. What about the name of the book? I am not sure. I know that we spoke about it, but I don't remember if we did this in the interview. So you could probably repeat again of the story of how you decided about the name of the book.
You know what? I think I'm going to do a little reading for you.
Oh, absolutely, with pleasure.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book yet. I just saw
Yeah.
it yesterday for the first time. So yes, please do some reading for me.
Yep.
And for you, of course.
Here we are.
All right.
Okay, so I'm quoting here. This is when I was in Mariupol, which is in February 2022, just 2 weeks before the full-scale invasion. And I'm interviewing my friend Tanya, who was an OSC, a monitor with the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. So she had a very, very interesting story because she was able to work both in occupied Donetsk and in Mariupol, which was in free Ukraine. And so she was one of the rare people who got to see both sides of the story. Anyway, so I said to her, she was coming out. As soon as she arrived in Mariupol, she said, "When you crossed the border to Ukrainian-controlled areas, I felt a certain lightness. I felt like we could breathe easier. I felt like I had this heavy weight pressing down on my lungs, and it just felt better. Young couples were holding hands and kissing, teenagers skateboarding, and I realized I hadn't seen that in Donetsk. There were cool, trendy restaurants. It was very artsy and alternative. I could have seen it being the next Berlin." I agreed with her impressions of the port city, but there was one thing that was unnerving me. I noticed the dogs in the city would not stop barking. It was rhythmic and frantic barking, as if they were shouting a warning in unison. I walked onto the beach, and a local woman had lost control of her 6 dogs, and they began running around madly, scratching, clawing, biting at her and each other. Animals have a sixth sense for subtle changes in their environment, and they could have been detecting the growing fear and unease in the local people that they were unwilling to vocalize. Perhaps they had a premonition of things to come. I tweeted at the time, "The dogs in Mariupol, eastern Ukraine, have been barking non-stop." Some half-remembered superstition from ghost stories I read in childhood came to mind, that dogs will howl when death is near. A Slavic folklore tradition says they're calling out to the approaching spectral hounds that are coming to collect the souls of the dead. I jotted in my notes, do they know something we don't?
Okay, that's amazing. I remember how you first told me this story. This sounds very special and actually making total sense for me, because animals indeed feels way more stuff than we could feel sometimes.
Yeah. Actually, interestingly enough, I remember talking to one of my colleagues who was there at the time. He's sort of a very sort of hard-nosed, very thinks this is kind of stupid superstition. He was like, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," blah blah blah. And so when I started talking about writing the book, as a kind of a dig at him, I'm like, I'm going to call it The Dogs of Mariupol just to annoy you. And so I ended up just putting that as like a working title on the document that I was submitting to the publisher. And they were like, "We really like this title," and people I've spoken to say, yeah, it's an interesting title. I do
think that it's an amazing title as well.
It invokes interesting imagery, and again, you ask the question, what's the title? Like some of the other books, and I don't mean to pick on any other authors here. They had names like The War, The Invasion, stuff like that. It's kind of like what it says on the tin, right? Which is, there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't leave you asking questions, if you know what I mean. I like having a title that makes people want to ask more questions.
Yes, well, indeed, it is. It is what it is. Yes, it is. Yes. I forgot what I wanted to say. But I also wanted to ask you, what was the hardest chapter for you to write in the book?
Ooh, the hardest chapter to write, because they all presented their own difficulties. So for instance, for one thing, the first chapter, so because there were some chapters that were really hard to write in a sort of I had to go out and collect a bunch of material in dangerous places, right? So the Kherson chapter was like that. I had to do a trip to Kherson when there was drones buzzing in the air and it was really dead, and that was one that was genuinely dangerous. But the actual writing of the chapter was fairly straightforward because we got a lot of interesting material from it. Now, what's really, really interesting for me was, but then, for instance, the first chapter, which is about the history of Ukraine and the build-up to the invasion, was actually really difficult to write because I had about 3,000 words to tell the history of Ukraine to someone who doesn't know anything about Ukraine. And so I had to hugely simplify and condense that history down into like a couple of easily digestible pages and leave loads and loads of stuff out just so that the reader has a background for what they're coming into in the book, right? And, you know, a lot of it was stuff, you know, when I'm writing about the Maidan and first Donbass war, well, I wasn't there for that. So that was quite difficult. Also, I think the first chapter, which is about it's about the invasion of northern Ukraine. So by that I mean Kiev, but not just Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, Zhytomyr. You know, it wasn't just an attack on the capital. And I think a lot of people forget that. That was also difficult because that's a story that's been told a lot, right? Like, people, if they know anything about Ukraine, they remember watching the tanks, you know, roll down the streets towards Kiev. They remember that huge big Russian column. They remember the helicopters flying into Hostomel. These are quite familiar, well-told stories. There are a fair few books that cover the first year of the war that tell these stories. So, in that case, it was like, how do I approach this? How do I find a new angle for this? And what I tried to do was I tried to look at it instead of just the battle for Kiev, I tried to expand it. And so I did a quite long section on the Battle of Chernihiv and also the Battle of Sumy as well, because those were very, very important battles that just aren't talked about as well, anywhere near as much. So, for instance, the battle around Chernihiv was just as important for saving Ukraine from falling to Russian occupation as the battle for Kiev was, but it has maybe not even a tenth of the attention, right? Like, even among professional analysts, they'll tell you, yeah, this is a battle that we haven't done as much research on as we really should have. We know the story of the Battle of Kiev now. We don't know a lot of the other stories that happen. And that was one of the interesting things actually finding, because there's so much. And I guess one of the other reasons I see you, to come back to when you were asking the question of why I thought I needed to write the book, is there's so much amazing content and writing and documentaries and videos about Ukraine and about the full-scale invasion. However, it's very fragmented. The material is kind of all over the place, right? You know, okay, there's like an amazing obscure YouTube series that's like about Ukraine's relationship with Russia and why it wanted to join NATO and why Poland and all those countries wanted to join NATO. It's on an obscure YouTube channel and it's really funny and you can check it out. It's in the acknowledgements. You know, the best account of Ukraine's counteroffensive is a Royal United Services Institute report. It's like a very technical, dry, academic, you know, text, but it just hits so many. It's the best analysis really of kind of not just the counteroffensive but modern war fighting. Chernihiv and Sumy, there's these amazing Ukrainian documentaries, you know, they're in Ukrainian dubbed into English, done by, you know, Suspilne and another local Ukrainian organization. There's all this great material, but there's no like one narrative of it, right? Like no one's for some reason really sat down and been like, okay, I'm going to write like the full narrative. I'm not trying to say I've done it comprehensively, but I've really tried to tell a full story to this day of how Ukraine has been affected. And so you can effectively pick up the book and you can kind of read it like a history, right? I've hit all the big notes here. So if you want a history as close as it can be written when the war's still going on, I think my book does the best job so far. Well, and I realized that there wasn't a book like that and I wanted to write. I was like, you know, I'm in a position to write it, so I will.
Great. Well, thank you for doing this. Yeah. It was some of the questions yesterday people asked you about how Western people, what you can do to get more attention and blah, blah, blah. But I want to ask what you feel about how this book might affect Western readers, because this is an English version. It will be Ukrainian version as well.
Yes, we hope so.
How do you think, or how would you like this book to affect Western readers?
For one thing, I want it to remind them that the war is still going on, right? Again, coming back to what I was saying about other books and other material, there are a lot of great books, but a lot of them were written in 2023, and they're excellent accounts of the build-up to the war and the first year of the war. But they kind of tend to end after about a year of the fighting, and the war in 2025 looks very, very different to the war in 2022. It's a bloodier war, it's a harder war, it's a more attritional fight. There's kind of less of that sort of brave underdog spirit that Ukraine really has. You know, that had in the first year of the war. There's no big victory like in Kharkiv or Kherson to sort of celebrate. There's, you know, the front lines kind of stay in the same place and move very, very slowly, if at all. You know, and so yeah, I also want to remind people, and I think what this book also tries to do is it tries to talk a little bit about the relationship between Ukraine and its wider partners, what Western countries should have done earlier and what they didn't do, and what Ukraine could have done better as well. So I think if there's anything, I want people to know, one, the war is still going on, and two, and this is the reason that this book focuses on soldiers and civilians, right? So I want people to remember the stakes for individual people's lives. So I mean, look, this book does have like I'm going to toot my own horn here, but this book does have, you know, very, very high level access. I got access to Ukraine, to presidential aides, Ukrainian cabinet ministers. I got 2 minutes with Zelensky. But it's not a political blow by blow of, you know, what was happening in the corridors of power in Bunkover Palace. It's an on the ground look at how it's affecting real people's lives. Yeah.
Good. Wow. I'm thinking about, what do you want me to ask about this book? Is it anything you couldn't say yesterday in BBC interview and you would like to say?
So I mean, I was lucky. Obviously, yeah, it was great to be on, but so one of the things you often in British broadcasting, they like you to be a little less emotional than you would kind of want to be. So, for instance,
Less emotional.
They want, yeah, like, you know, British broadcasting is sort of very stiff upper lip. You know, yeah. You kind of sit like this, and your hands are clasped, and the presenter is like very, very well made up. You know, sharp jawline, and yes, that's more, yeah. And so it's not even like the content that I could say, but you just kind of can't express the same emotions, personal passions. I guess one thing that is worth saying is that, and I talked a little bit about this on the radio when I was on this weekend, just being with Sean Penner, who is a British guy who has he was captured in Mariupol, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And he was exchanged in the big exchange that happened in, I think it was October 2022. And he was just, you know, talking about, you know, Ukraine is my home. I fought to defend it. I'm still here. I still love it. You know, my wife's Ukrainian. I'm sort of fighting for my home and my freedom and stuff like that. And I do think that one of the interesting things is I've lived in Ukraine. I've been back and forth for 3 years now. And it's like, look, by now, we know about no one who's lived in Ukraine for that long has not seen a bit of the ugly side of Ukraine. We know it has problems with corruption, right? Like, you know, we know that people aren't always entirely straightforward with you and things like that. But despite having seen that, we are still passionate supporters of Ukraine, despite the fact that we know the country sort of warts and all, if you know what I mean. It's a little bit like if you have a relationship with someone and you see their flaws after a while and you decide to stick with them regardless. That's how the vast majority of foreigners who've come to Ukraine and stayed have felt and continue to feel, I think. So I think that's very, very important.
This is such a nice comparing, because this is actually true that despite of all the problems you just decide to stay and to support, and that's what I personally feel as well, so I can relate to this as well as a foreigner who still supports Ukraine, and I would totally move if not my Polish private life, and who would do Ukraine TV if I will move to Ukraine, but I might move soon. Actually, I'm still thinking of it.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, Ukraine, actually, another thing I dislike the most about living in Ukraine. It's
Yeah,
very
what? Tell
small.
me.
Not having an airport is such a pain in the neck.
Oh,
so
yes.
annoying.
Yeah.
Having to you have to budget 24 hours. It's obviously not Ukraine's fault, but having to budget 24 hours each way for travel on especially if you take a cramped bus, it's not fun. Yeah. That said, Ukraine has incredible trains.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I was about to say.
There's a section in here about the trains, and they called it Iron People actually. So yeah,
They're called trains.
No, they're called the people who worked on the trains, like Iron People, and that's kind of another another sort of thing that I drew on for the idea of the Iron Generation.
Okay, well, yeah, that was first thing what surprised me, because my first trip in Ukraine after I've been in Crimea when I was small with my parents before 2014 was the 2023 trip to Kiev, and I was surprised with how good the train was. I was like, wow, am I entering high level Europe? Like, I haven't had such trains in Europe, and that was super good. And the food in the train and how the guys super polite here. It's like, wow, that's a high class. That's super cool.
Ukraine can sometimes surprise you because it is technically a very poor country, yet somehow it has quite a good standard of living, and people sort of make do with not very much very, very well. Like, there's no one I've never met a people who are as good as making do with very little and turning it into something really important than Ukrainians. I think, actually, to go back to one of the topics in the book, that you can see that with weapons, right? We at one point, I'm gonna if it doesn't take me too long to find, I want to do a short...
I just want to shout a quick comment that I am very surprised and disappointed with quality of food in London, and I need to tell how food is good in Ukraine. This is one of the things which is also surprising, especially for someone who might lived in Europe most of the time, or like a foreigner. Trust me, you would be absolutely surprised with the quality and the variety of food you can meet in Ukraine, and obviously the prices. And this is a sad at some point thing, that you're coming here and you're like in such a high class Europe, I would say. But still, we just spoke with Tom right before the interview that it seems that this country is not made for comfortability of people, and this is what my mind's stuck for.
It's a digression, but I've sometimes met people from Central and Eastern Europe who were kind of brought up with this idea that their countries are like really poor and backwards and shitty, and they're really not. Like, not anymore anyway. Yes. It's like in 2025, places like Poland and Ukraine, you can have just as nice a life there as you can in London, with the exception of the missiles in Kiev, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I wanted to go back to is that one moment that stuck out for me when I was reporting this book was I was in Zaporizhia. So people who don't know, it's a city pretty close to the front lines. It's it's where a lot of the big battles and the counteroffensive took place. So it's right. It's just on the Dnipro. It's kind of in the center, a bit to the east. And we went to this guy. He'd been a mechanic in his ordinary life, and he was taking tubes and buying cheap trucks for $2,000-$3,000, strapping the tubes on the back of trucks, and they would work as like a Grad artillery system, right? Yeah, and he would give them to the soldiers, and they were able to use them. And he was building a Grad portable rocket launcher that worked probably about 60 to 70% as well as the regular one for $10,000, right? To give you a sort of what that costs in Western terms, a single Western artillery shell costs $3,000, right? And to build a system like that would be $1 million, and they were doing it in their backyards for $10,000. And a lot of the drone production has come from things like that. A lot of it is being made, literally, guys are buying components of Chinese websites, assembling them in Ukraine and making them and they, basically putting them on the battlefield. Actually, and this is a weird thing, I don't know why nobody has thought about sanctioning Chinese firms that sell drone parts to Russia. I think that's an interesting thing, because people talk about people that are buying like Russian oil and gas. Drone components going from China, and they're going to both sides, to be fair. Chinese drone production companies making an absolute fortune off this war. But yeah, I don't know why that's never really been addressed.
That's an interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I know you don't work in like the European Union's sanctions department or anything. So yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't. Or maybe fortunately for me, because it's a tough work, I bet.
Yeah.
Any plans for future books? Do you think it's was it an idea that it's going to be just one book, or you plan now just to kind of like continue? And do you think you would ever start to write another book?
I really like the process of writing books. It's very different to doing doing day-to-day news reporting. It's a very different feel, because you get to really spend a lot of time with people. So for instance, I'll take the examples of. I'll give you a couple of examples. Katerina, who I told you about here, there's a young woman called Helga, she was in Mariupol. She was the receptionist at my hotel in Mariupol, and she got stuck in Mariupol when the invasion started. She wrote a diary of the time, which she called it 20 Days in Mariupol, like the famous film. It's absolutely harrowing. It's extraordinarily well written. I've reproduced it, almost in full in this book with her permission. And Oksana and Stanislav, the couple that I showed you before, Oksana Lasovi, who's now the education minister, I met them in 2022. Some of them I met in 2023, and by the time I came to write this book, met with them again. And what that allowed me to do is I can now, rather than saying I went here and I met this person and this is what she told me, I can trace the narrative arc of someone's life across years, and that you can't really do in even the longest of long form journalism. You can't really sit down and be like, okay, this is what happened and this is what it means in the wider historical context. And I was really, really grateful that the book planned to do that. So, well, for one, I'm hoping to do, almost certainly going to do a Ukrainian edition, a Ukrainian translation. I'm going to expand and update a lot of the things. So there will probably be, most books come out in second editions, they come out in paperback editions. And I've already got a bunch of stuff that I want to write about for the second edition. So for instance, I wanted to write about Belarus and how the full-scale invasion had affected Belarus. I wrote about Armenia, but that's because I lived there. There's a section here about Nagorno-Karabakh, which I think people will find interesting and how that relates. But I've never been to Belarus, and I was like, if I want to do something about Belarus, I kind of need to spend a long time sitting down with Belarusian people and talking about how they think and feel. And so that's the kind of thing that I want to do in either a kind of updated edition. Also, if the war goes on for another 3 years, I'll probably write a sequel as well.
Well, let's hope that...
Yeah. And if anyone is preferably Ukrainian, is looking for a project, there is a gaping hole in the market for a book on Ukraine, and I'm not the one to do it, from 2013 to 2022. Because that's a very important period for Ukraine, and it's very, very poorly covered.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So Chris Miller's book, I think, is, for instance, The War Came to Us, is absolutely fantastic on 2013, 2014. Knocked it out of the park. Best version of it in English by a mile. Then it skips straight to 2022. And I was like, there's just a hole here, right? Like someone needs to come and do that. And I'd be happy to help them do it, but I think it should be someone who lived there and was on the ground for most of that time.
Yes, sounds like it. Okay, wow. That was super cool as always. It's as you once said, but I would agree with it forever, that you are the most easy person to interview. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to join your book presentation yesterday.
No worries.
And for this interview. Yeah. And do you want to sign the books for me because I'm taking them home
Of
to our
course, of
studio.
course I do. If you can get me, do you have a pen?
Yes,
Do you wanna,
I
I'll
don't have a
start.
pen though. Do you have a pen?
Oh my god,
If not, then-
we're terrible journalists. Yeah,
It's fine. Then we're gonna get a pen.
yeah,
and,
we will do it. We will
I'll film
figure it
another
out.
video.
I'll sign
do
it
another
in
video.
invisible
Okay.
ink right
All
now.
right.
Okay, well, again, thank you everybody for listening. I'm really hoping you get to check out the book. It's put a lot of work into it, and I try to tell a story as I've seen it, and as Ukrainians have seen it, and even occasionally as Russians have seen it. I have interviewed Russian people for the book. I guess that's another thing as well. Actually, I obviously hate the Russians, and I don't agree with any of their perspectives, but there is a chapter in here, it's called The Russians and How They Rule, that attempts to try and look at things from the Russian perspective. It's difficult to do, but that's a chapter that I'd be very, very interested in what people in general think of, because that's probably if you were going back to what we said at the start about like the most difficult chapter to write, that was difficult, right? Because
I was thinking about this chapter. I saw it briefly yesterday, and I was curious why happened to mention this. And you said about this chapter about on your presentation yesterday, and I think that is the hard part, though, because obviously Russia is very big, and we can't say, though I am very oftenly saying this, and I am not really sorry that most of the Russians are imperialistic mindsets, have imperialistic mindsets, and they are not entirely against the war, but obviously we all understand that there are people who are against this, and I do agree indeed, and I can imagine how hard it was for you to actually try to show this perspective just for educational purposes.
Yeah, so I basically had three main sources for that chapter. So one was I have a colleague who spent quite a bit of time working in the occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions between 2014 and 2022, and he was kind enough to do some work for this book and calling some of his old contacts and being asking what they thought of what had happened. A lot of them were like pro Russian Ukrainians, who, while they're rare, they do exist, right? I think it is worth saying, and they had a very, very interesting perspective on the war, because often they thought that they had been really screwed over by the Russians as well. And one of the things that I thought come out, and this is why I mentioned it in my presentation, was that a lot of people, especially from Donbass, feel that they were used by the Russians, not because the Russians cared about them, because the Russians wanted a stick to beat Ukraine with. Other parts of it, I spent a bit of time in Georgia, in Tbilisi, where I interviewed Russian exiles, people who were coming across the border. And I also went into Kursk, into Suja, and obviously I had a chance to interview Ukrainian civilians, when we were in a basement in Suja, where a lot of them were hiding out. One of the things is, yes, Russians tend to have an imperial mindset, but one of the things that did irk me is that while I met a number of like anti-war, anti-Putin Russians, what annoyed me is that they seemed to think that they were the real victims in all of this, right? Like they sort of seemed to think, oh my god, I had to like leave Russia and live in like a nice apartment in Tbilisi or Istanbul, and it's been really, really hard for me, and I don't know when I'll go back to Russia. And I'm like, that's kind of sad, I guess, and I'm sorry that happened to you. But compared to someone from Mariupol or Bucha or Kharkiv, you have no idea. And that was one of the things that irritated me about the so-called good Russians, if we want to go into that topic.
Absolutely, felt the same when I was in Georgia, and we had an amazing talk with girls from the Diachi community from Georgia. It was an amazing interview, I remember, and how they were saying that when huge protests were coming in Georgia, you could easily see who is a Russian, because all of the young people were joining the protests, Ukrainians, Belarusians, were supporting Georgian people, but Russians were sitting in the cafes and having coffees, because they said that it's not their protest, it's not their war, and they are just victims, they are just like kind of hiding. And this is what actually always said for me the most, that I am not the person that tended to hate someone or judge someone, but indeed it feels for me that, all right, you fled from Russia, so you're technically safe now, and you have the possibility of supporting other countries' independency, and you're still not doing that. And as you said, saying that you are a victim when it's not entirely the, like...
Yeah, so one of the things, for instance, that I remember in Georgia particularly is I interviewed this one young woman who, to be fair, she was helping run a refugee center for both Ukrainians and Russians who had fled. And I interviewed her, and she spoke to me in good faith, but she said something that was stuck with me. She said at the end of our interview, she's like, why does everyone think that, Russians that we all are against the war? I've left my home, I've done this, I've done, I don't support the war in any way. And I'm like, well, because we don't see you oppose the war, right? Like, you're in Georgia, you're safe. Why are you guys not outside the Russian embassy protesting with banners that say, not in our name, Russians speak out against terrorism in Ukraine or something like that? Why do none of my Russian friends on social media, I haven't seen any of them post anything about Ukraine since maybe the first week of the war?
Yeah.
And they're like, and she said something, she's like, yeah, but it wouldn't do anything, it wouldn't help. The people in Russia are all powerful, yes. And they, nothing we can do will ever, be able to inflict any damage on the regime. And I was like, well, they've fallen for the propaganda as well, but they've fallen for a slightly different propaganda,
yes.
Which is the idea that
the governmental machine is bigger than you and your opinion and your power, and that's what I have experienced.
Nothing that ordinary people can do.
Yes, that's what I have experienced living in Belarus. That your vote doesn't matter, your voice doesn't matter. You are just a tiny little piece, and you can change anything. That police and government could oppress you. You just need to stay silent. But this is not true, and I feel now there is election time in Poland, and it's gonna be because the first wave already passed and I couldn't vote, but I'm gonna vote another second tour, and I feel so much responsibility. It's gonna be my first ever election because I could vote already in 2020, but it was no point because people came to Warsaw, they were staying in line for many hours, didn't get a chance to vote, didn't help. So we all kind of hoped, but also understood that it's no point of voting on Belarusian election. But it's different in Poland, and the way I feel responsible now, it's very different from what I felt all my life living in Belarus.
Yeah.
But I still think that you need to understand and kind of educate yourself that you do matter, your voice matter, democracy matter, and democracy could be built only if you kind of help it to rebuild it.
And the thing is, this is a mentality that Ukrainians have, right? They can be rambunctious and loud and rabble-rousing, get in people's faces, but they protest, they take personal responsibility.
Yes.
They see themselves as members of a civic, democratic society.
Yeah.
And Russian people, by and large, I haven't seen that from them ever. And I remember once one of the guys said, a guy from Slavyansk said to me, and he lived under occupation for the 6 weeks or so that Slavyansk was occupied in 2014. He said to me, I think this would be an interesting note to end the interview on, when we had wannabe dictators in the early 90s, when we wanted to get rid of the Soviet Union, 2004, 2014, when we had wannabe dictators, we rose up and we got rid of them. The Russians had a chance to do that in 2012, but they stopped. They never went back to it again. But Ukrainians are the ones who are paying the prices for that Russian failure. Yeah, and I think that's some food for thought.
It's a very good quote to finish our interview on. It's been already almost 1 hour, and I think we did a great job. Thank you, Tom, again.
No worries, no worries. Thank you again for having me for, as I said, what I'm sure will not be the last time.
Yes. Bye-bye.
До побачення. Дуже вам дякую за ваш час. Я думаю, що я розмовляю українською мовою трошки краще зараз.
Краще. Так, я погоджуюсь. Мені здається, теж розмовляю вже краще українською, тому two foreigners speaking Ukrainian. Yeah.